that this is also, of course, about form and emptiness, and also about life and death. And I actually started to write a bunch of stuff about death, and I thought, wait a minute, that's a whole, that deserves its own attention. So I decided to start talking a little bit about death. And it's and as I was thinking about this, it kind of surprises me that I haven't talked about death much at all. And actually Zen is really, that's what Zen is really about in a way. And in a sense, all religions are about helping us cope with this greatest existential challenge that we ever face in our lives. And so anyway, and considering that I have really been involved in death and death studies and so forth for a long time, it's kind of surprising to me that I haven't talked about it. But I think it's probably just because, although I've paid a lot of attention to it, I'm in a daily denial about its reality for me. Because I kind of think all of you are going to die, but I can't really imagine that I'm going to die. So I'm just like everyone else. I exist in a state of denial, but maybe now it's time to turn towards. And I want to thank Tari for bringing this up when we were meeting together, and talking about things, that we would like to consider in this next year. So we've talked very much about how the self protects itself, that the self is designed to be protected, in a sense, from the realization of death, of its non-existence, to be protected from non-existence so skillfully. This design is so skillful that we hardly ever think about it unless we have to. And now I started thinking about it as an adult in 1982, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer for the first time at the age of 37. And apart from pain, debility, and disfigurement, the fourth horseman of cancer is death. And I was terrified that I would die. Fortunately, I had a wonderful surgeon, and he said to me, seeing my fear, Mary Ellen, you can live every day as though you're dying, or you can live your life. And that woke me up. And maybe that was my first Zen moment. Excuse me, I'm going to get my teaching stick that I always forget to use. And it's kind of a little bit of a security blanket or a teddy bear for me. Anyway, so, for those of you who have had this experience of being diagnosed with a disease that might take your life, you feel as though you're teetering on the edge of a precipice, and that surely you're going to fall soon, plunging first into a world of pain, loss of control, diminishment, loss of ability, and then annihilation. And my little Zen calendar this week said, one of the pages said something like, you're standing on a precipice there, and there are no instructions. And that's what it feels like. It's that reality that I think we're able to deny forcefully and skillfully every day of our lives. And it's often said that we live in a death-denying culture. We spend most of our lives never encountering a dying person or seeing a corpse, which is so unusual in the history of mankind, when death was just part of family life. Everyone died at home, and everyone who was at home took care of the dying person. But in our culture, death and dying are not part of our daily landscape. And so every day, our culture conspires to protect each one of us from the threat of death and to sequester death behind a wall of systems attended by specialists. But I was forced to bring it to my consciousness. I've been on death row for 39 years because with breast cancer, the risk of recurrence never goes away, which unfortunately I was reminded of that when I was talking to my oncologist, maybe a year ago. And I said, hey, it's pretty good that I've survived all this time, right? He said, no, your risk never goes away. Oh, okay. So there it is again, staring me in the face. And all these years at varying intervals, I've had follow-up visits with doctors and tests and scans, and then waited for the verdict over and over and over again, like a bad dream, and not with a nice ending like on Groundhog Day. And so far, every time I've been granted a reprieve, a stay of execution. But one day I know I won't. And I actually had a little brush with this past fall when I was having some symptoms that seemed to suggest that I might have a more serious disease than the slow growing blood cancer that I have. And so I had to have a big CT CAT scan, and I had to wait a month to get it scheduled. And so I had a month to think about what I would do if the diagnosis and the prognosis was bad. So one day, and it wasn't, so I'm still here, on death row, waiting for the day when somebody's going to tell me, we're moving you to the cell that is the last cell that you'll live in before you die. So, but really that's how we all live. We just don't pay attention to it. So, when I was thinking about this talk, I remembered this poem that you probably studied in high school by John Donne, 16th century poet. No man is an island. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. The bell tolls for thee. This phrase has haunted me ever since I was in high school. In fact, it's the only part of the poem that I remembered. And of course, the bell is really tolling for all of us all the time, but we can't or won't hear it. And sometimes it really is distant. But Zen practice calls us to listen and to turn towards the call of the bell and to open our awareness to death and our fear of it. Not to expect ourselves to be unafraid, but to turn both towards contemplation of death and our fear of it. The body and our consciousness function under a biological imperative to live and to stay alive. The body tries to stay alive under all circumstances. It fights to stay alive from the first breath, the first cry, which is a demand for help out of helplessness. People fight to preserve life in the most dire circumstances. And the body of a dying person fights to stay alive until it can't anymore. Almost everything we do in our daily life is about staying alive. Almost every function that we do, eating, sleeping, clothing our bodies, sheltering ourselves, even our relationships, are all necessary to preserve this one life. If we leave out one of these mundane, ordinary things, eventually we die. Our whole life is about staying alive, really. Zen is famous for turning our regard toward death. In Japan, people go to the Shinto temple for a celebration of birth and growth milestones, to the Christian church for weddings often, and to the Zen temple for funerals, interment, and commemoration of death. One of my Zen friends started years ago a practice. He got a big, huge glass jug, and he filled it with pebbles. And he takes one pebble out of this jar I can't remember how often, I think every week. And he watching the jar gradually empty to keep his awareness of his inexorable march towards his ending. I've lost touch with him, so I don't know how far, I think he's still alive, but I don't know how far the jug has gone down. And so even though I have been on death row for so long, I didn't really begin to turn towards death until I started to study Zen in my late 50s. And well, I guess my mid 50s. And it occurred to me at that point in my career as doing OBGYN as a certified nurse midwife. And I'd been in practice by that time for, 20 years or so. That, and you know, I had not only obstetric patients, but I had mature women, and then beginning to have more and more elderly women for gynecology. And I suddenly realized, oh, death and dying are not, and old age, death and dying are not another country that I will never visit. I'm actually on the road to that country. So maybe I better start paying attention. So I really started looking at my elderly patients. I was, of course, defining elderly as, maybe, 65 or older then. As Ram Dass said when he wrote his book about aging at 65 and then reviewing it at 80, he said, what did I know at 65? Oh, well, okay. So anyway, I did start to pay attention, and then I became fascinated with it. I had been a Zen student for about 5 years when my father entered his last illness. And because of Zen, I really think I was able to be fully there, watching and waiting, knowing when it was time to ask the doctor that it was time to tell my stepmother that my father could not survive and should be taken off of life support. Watching his last smile fade from his face after his last breath. It takes quite a long time for the expression to fade, which was one of the most beautiful things that I ever saw. And after that, right away, I knew that I would somehow be involved in hospice. And as soon as I retired in 2007, I became a hospice volunteer. And then after my ordination, a year later, I became a volunteer hospice chaplain, which I did for 8 years. And during that time, I took training as an end-of-life practitioner from the Metta Institute, which is a meditation-based training program for hospice workers of all professions. And I also studied and trained and became certified as a thanatologist, a specialist in death, from the Greek word thanatos, meaning death, from the Association for Death Education and Counseling. And as a result of that, as many of you know, I started the program I call Turning Towards, a group experience of personal death awareness, to help people to be able to face their own death and the death of their loved ones. And I love this work, and I loved being a chaplain. I retired from the chaplaincy when soon after we started Bodhi Oak, because it was too much to do at the same time. One thing about death is that it strips away pretense and superficiality. And I think it did that for me even at the age of 37, although I still, had a lot more stripping away to do. But it just woke me up to, oh, I need to pay attention to what's really important in my life. And one of the things that I really appreciated about being a hospice chaplain is that there's no pretense. People are really their raw selves. The dying person is really not pretending anymore and not having to look good or whatever their refuge was. They don't have that anymore. And same with the family. And that way you can develop a relationship really quickly and a really honest, truthful, deep connection. So do I know something about death? I don't really know anything about death. I know nothing. And because it's unknowable except to the person who's doing it. People talk about near-death experiences, but even that is near death, and they're not dead when they're talking about it. It's not death. The mind actually can't comprehend its own annihilation as far as we know. I mean, I would like to think that there's consciousness remaining, and in some Buddhist traditions, there is thinking that espouses that thought, but Zen doesn't. In particular, Zen prefers not to know what happens. And Zen asks us to contemplate the annihilation of ourself, to sit down and to forget ourselves, to let the self lapse. As Dogen said, to forget the self that we strive so hard to grow, maintain, preserve, and defend. To stand in unknowing, not in our knowing and expertise. To stand in our existential nothingness, in the stream, not in the drop. If we step out of our self-centered dream of separateness and see ourselves as merely a drop in the stream or a spark in the universe for a moment, perhaps we can let our defenses down and relax into the great flow of beginningless and endless life, because there's nothing to prove and nothing to protect and nothing to defend. But then we snap back into our separate consciousness and think, no, thank you. I'd rather be a drop. The stream, you can go and do your thing. I'll stay here as a drop or as a whirlpool. And we're not alone in this. Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, before he became awakened, when he first saw a dead person, was so horrified, shocked, and revolted. He couldn't comprehend how people could face the horror of death. The very, very honest reaction. He was so shocked by illness, old age, and death that he was compelled to find a way to live with such suffering. And I think in a way that's how my life has gone. Because Zen asks us to feel this shock and to turn towards this suffering. And when with a life-threatening illness, it's there, it's staring you in the face. And for some reason, all my life, I've been faced with being terribly afraid of so many things. And then somehow figuring out that I had to learn as much as I could about the things that I was afraid of. So, you know, when I was a teenager, I was afraid of sex. So I became, you know, when I was a nurse midwife, I developed a specialty in sexual counseling and advice. So I was terribly afraid of birth. I remember when I was a freshman in college, in our dorm, there was a film of someone giving birth, and I ran out of the room to throw up. I was so horrified. So, of course, I had to get pregnant and have two babies, and then I had to be a midwife and deliver babies for my whole professional career. And so, you know, then death, you know, which is of course the thing I was most afraid of. I had to become a so-called specialist in death. So anyway, that seems to be somehow my karma. So it'd be interesting for you guys. I would like you to sort of think about, why would one want to turn towards death? What would be the point of that? So here's a story that's often told about the Buddha's approach to death. A young woman's infant son fell ill and died. And distraught, she went from house to house in her village, asking everyone she saw if they could bring her son back to life. And finally, someone suggested that she ask the Buddha for help. And he said, go to every house in the village and ask for a mustard seed from any family that has not lost a family member in death. Bring it back to me and I'll help you. So she went from house to house, but in the end, she returned to the Buddha empty-handed. And he said, this is true for everyone. Always, we all suffer in this way. So, and that was supposed to be, you know, the Buddha's insight into death and loss. And my first take on this story was that it's very cold, it seemed to me, as if the Buddha were saying, quit crying. Your grief is not special. And actually, often that's kind of the way that this story is interpreted, is as a hedge against grief and loss and sadness and death. That we shouldn't be grieving, we shouldn't feel sad, we shouldn't mourn. But later, I came to feel that, in fact, our consolation is really in the community, in the shared experience. We face this tragedy together. We share our grief because no man is an island and every death matters. We accept impermanence and we grieve. It's not one or the other. Our grief is more poignant, more tender in our acceptance of its shared inevitability. And to the extent that we can really experience it in ourselves, we can be present to each other and walk with each other in our love and grief as we approach the precipice. And as I've said so many times before, this is the Four Noble Truths. We turn towards suffering. We turn towards death. We see and understand our clinging. It's not that we berate ourselves for clinging. It's that we see that we try to escape suffering by clinging. We awaken to the transformation of suffering through compassion and wisdom. And then we just keep going and be of benefit to others. And then life is so beautiful, vivid, poignant, and full of love. Now, there's so much more to say. I had to sort of stop myself because